Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining CSBA for the latest installment of our annual tradition, where we analyze the governor's May revised budget. Today, we'll be looking at the 26-27 May revised proposal and the impacts it proposes for California public schools. We'll provide an overview of the budget, deep dive analysis from CSBA's governmental relations experts, and at the end of the presentation, we'll offer a Q&A session where you can pose queries to those experts on the issues of most relevance for your local school districts and county offices of education. Before we get into the heart of the webinar, we're going to take care of a few housekeeping details. As mentioned earlier, please reserve your questions until the end of the presentation, where we will have an extensive Q&A segment, and we will do our level best to get to all the questions that you have for our speakers. You may notice that there are some icons at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A icon, the one with multiple chat boxes or multiple speech boxes, not the chat prompt, the one with the single speech box at the bottom. This helps us make sure that we are collecting all the questions in one place so we can get to as many as possible. Thank you in advance for your cooperation. Next slide, please. So with us today, we have a number of experts, people who have deep and long experience in working with the budget and with the legislature and administration, and also in school districts and county offices of education. So there's a well-rounded perspective that we'll be able to share with you. And that's led by our Chief of Governmental Relations, Patrick O'Donnell, our Legislative Director, Chris Reef, and our legislative advocates, Carlos Machado, Dan Merwin, and Marissa Vismara. I'm Troy Flint, your Chief Communications Officer, and I'll be the moderator for today, handling the Q&A session and doing a brief intro before we kick it over to Patrick.
Great, thank you, Troy.
Yeah.
So simply, what is the May revise? Well, it is, as it suggests, it is a revision. It is a revision of the governor's budget proposal he laid out in January. Okay? It's based on a formal presentation of updated general fund revenues, and they were received in mid-April. Those were the income tax filings. So the money has been collected, and now the governor's revising his budget proposal based on the new money collected, the new numbers that come in. That can be very high, it can be very much lower than his January proposal, but they're higher this year, as you'll come to find out, than he originally proposed in January. Okay, he is required by law to present this report, this May revise, by May 14th. Okay, and again, it is an opportunity for the governor to provide an update on the state general fund revenues, okay, of the current and coming budget years, the governor's proposals to expand or reduce programs and expenditures. Okay, again, as I mentioned, this year he will be expanding his proposal based on the new numbers, which are higher than projected. Okay, state law also requires that the May revise include an update on Proposition 98 funding. And that's, of course, the state's effort to meet its constitutional guarantee to fund schools. Okay. Let's go to the state budget as a whole. Okay. This is Governor Newsom's last May revise, right? He will be out of office in about 6 months or so, 7 months or so. And so, again, this is his last May revise. And note that the state's nonpartisan, okay, independent, if you will, Legislative Analyst's Office projected an $18 billion deficit just last November. So you can see revenues have really turned around, and that's reflected in this budget. Okay. Growth in personal incomes and capital gains, largely driven by AI, now note AI here, has led to the state revenues surpassing the projections, $58 billion, okay, beyond those LAO estimates. Okay, so a lot more money coming in, but there's an asterisk on that AI, okay? Is it sustainable? Okay, are those revenues coming in from the AI stocks, et cetera, sustainable? Probably not. So we need to be cautious. Okay? And we don't know what next year is going to look like. We don't know if AI is in a bubble or it's going to stay at the level it is, the stocks and things like that. Okay. The governor is proposing a balanced budget over the next 2 fiscal years. Now, after that, deficits reappear. To our next slide. Okay. Now let's take a look at the numbers. Overall, the state budget is $349.9 billion. Okay. pretty large figure. Okay, this includes all federal, state, and special funding. Okay, state revenues are up by $16.5 billion over the January proposal. You can see the general fund share there is at 246.6 billion. Okay. And that's a decrease from compared to the January budget. That's as a share of the entire revenues. Okay. Okay. The budget includes an increase of deposits to state reserves of about $30 billion. You can see a deposit into the general fund reserve, the special fund for economic uncertainties, and that's $20 billion more or less right there. And then $10.3 billion into the Proposition 98 rainy day fund. And that is a special reserve just for Proposition 98. So more revenues, yes, but also a lot of those dollars going into the reserve. Okay. Now risks remain. Okay. As I alluded to earlier, okay, deficits are on the horizon. Okay, not this year, likely not next year, but in the out years, significant deficits are projected. And federal actions continue to impact public education funding in California. And the state's revenue structure is highly dependent on the top 1% of income earners. Just think of California's budget, it's kind of like a yo-yo. Why? Because we have a very progressive budget. We tax the billionaires in California. Yes, we do, at a pretty significant rate. And this impacts our budget. Okay. In years of plenty, our budget skyrockets. In years when the wealthy aren't making a lot of money, our budget will plunge faster than most. So again, a budget that's built on just a small segment of our population. Okay. Now, in response, the governor continues to call for doubling of the Proposition 2 State General Fund reserve cap, and those are the reserve dollars we set aside. The governor wants to set aside more dollars into the reserve. Now, arguably, they could do it without a proposition. Okay, but there was a proposition passed, 10 years or so ago, probably short of that, that established these reserves because prior years there weren't reserves. But the governor wants to expand the required reserve, those dollars put away for future economic circumstances. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Reeve, who's going to talk about Proposition 98.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll cover this. So moving on to Prop 98, I'm going to talk about what the formula is telling us the revenues make available for education funding for the next 3 years. Well, this year and then last year and the budget year. Next slide, please. So we have higher revenues. Therefore, we're likely to have higher Proposition 98 guarantee. The revised guarantee just for the current year is 125.1 billion, which is 3.7 billion higher than it was even in January. The guarantee in 26-27, the budget year, is now at 127.1 billion, and that's also a pretty substantial increase. Collectively, over the 3-year period, it's about 6.4 billion higher than was assumed in January. Now, when we account for certain kind of exceptions to Prop 98 funding that doesn't get calculated when you divide it up between the K-12 share and the community college share, you have about 122.9 billion that's split between those two systems. The split is pretty typical, about 89-11. So that leaves TK through 12 with almost $110 billion. The revised 3-year estimate is listed here as follows. I've covered both 25-26 and 26-27, but you can see those revenues are quite high, and so that does allow for some pretty significant investments. Next slide, please. Now, what's important to consider is sometimes we're talking about different time periods when we're making the comparison. That $6.4 billion increase is based on the estimate in January. But if you look at the last enacted budget, which was June last year, we're looking at $28 billion more overall within Proposition 98. Now, just kind of for comparison, when we looked at last year, they did a 3-year over 3-year comparison. That was actually a $300 million decrease. That tells you how much change we're seeing in the economy and how much they're projecting that to affect the state's revenues going forward. I'd say that we do have this projected increase of $21.7 billion is what we had in January, and then that $6.4 billion again is the difference between January and now. Over all 3 years, we continue to operate under Test 1, which means that education funding receives about 40% of every additional dollar that comes in through the revenue. It's actually 39.3% if we're being precise. It also means that property taxes really impact education funding as well. Next slide, please. Another part of Prop 98 is the reserve. This is also similarly formula driven. Just for kind of comparison, January estimated we'd have a balance on the reserve of $4.1 billion, a couple of deposits, a required withdrawal, and a discretionary deposit. And that was a huge change from just the year before where we had zeroed out the reserve. It had been about $8 billion, dropped to zero, rebuilding it almost immediately to 4.1. Well, higher revenues, higher deposits. We're still looking at a discretionary deposit as part of this mix, but the required deposits are well over $8 billion, and the total would be $10.3 billion at the end of this budget cycle. Now, that does trigger the 10% local reserve cap. That's a cap on your unrestricted reserves. Exempt from that requirement, small school districts and community funded or basic aid districts. You can also pursue a waiver through your county for 2 out of 3 years if that continues to be an issue. Next slide, please. Another, I think, surprising but beneficial aspect of the higher revenues, full repayment of the Proposition 98 maintenance factor. So you may recall that back in 23-24, we created a maintenance factor when we suspended the Prop 98 guarantee. We funded schools lower than what they were constitutionally required to receive. And that was an $8.3 billion debt that the state took on. Repayment of this debt is formula driven. As the general fund recovers, kind of first call on those recovery dollars goes back to education. Well, because the state recovered so quickly, that full 8.3 billion is now projected to be repaid. It had been about 5 billion last year, 7.5 billion in January, and now the full amount. And that's probably the fastest I think I've seen a maintenance factor ever be repaid, and will probably set a record. But that is what maintenance factor is, what makes the guarantee work. That if we have to fund under the guarantee for whatever reason, there's been a vote to suspend, and then the state takes on debt that it must repay. Next slide, please. COLA. So a couple things here. COLA is dictated by statute. The revised COLA, it had been 2.41% in January, is now 2.87%. We just have a few more data points. That's what the calculation spits out. However, on top of that 2.87%, the governor is proposing an additional 1.4%. This would be just for LCFF. Other programs would receive just the statutory COLA. Now, this is something that you may have heard referred to as a super COLA. It's a term of art that I've heard a few times whenever there's some kind of additional funding up and above COLA. I think back in 22-23, there was about a 1% increase, and it was similarly referred to as a super COLA then. However, there's a little bit of a catch here. This caveat, and we'll talk about this program later, that this additional funding through that 1.4% super COLA, first call on that goes to a mandatory pregnancy leave program. So we'll talk about what that entails, but just keep that in mind that if you were to maybe deduct the amount that's going to a new mandate, that super COLA doesn't seem quite so super anymore. And of course, it's still less than what your costs actually are. The 2.87% statutory COLA, as I mentioned, that is still going to be the COLA that will apply for your categoricals that typically receive COLA. One exception to that, state preschool is actually receiving an even lower COLA of 2.01%. That program is partially funded within Prop 98, partially outside of 98. So I think there's just a little bit of alignment between the two there. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Dan. So, as many of you, I'm sure, have been hearing in relation to the announcement of the May revise last week, unfortunately, the governor is doubling down on his proposed withholding of Prop 98 funds. Now, this is a reduction of the number that we saw in January, where he proposed that $5.6 billion withholding, reducing to about $3.9 billion. But at the same time, it's still a withholding. And this will be a third manipulation of Prop 98 if this continues. And so this continues to really threaten the guarantee. as Dan talked about when regarding the maintenance factor, remember when we have maintenance factor, think of maintenance factor as debt, right? If the state cannot afford to fully fund Prop 98, they have constitutional tools already available to them to reduce the amount of Prop 98 funding, and the amount that they reduce it by becomes debt that is then owed to Prop 98 and thus owed to public education. Again, to emphasize that piece is that the guarantee is rested in the fact that the debt is repaid, right? That's what makes the guarantee the guarantee. The withholding undermines that construct. And so this is very concerning. CSBA continues to oppose this. And I just will share here that based upon the most recent enrollment numbers, it comes to about $643 per student if that is retained in the budget. So this is a concerning possible precedent that's being set, that this is a way for the legislature and the governor to get out from underneath fully funding Prop 98. That is not how Prop 98 works. It actually violates the spirit and intent and the purpose of Prop 98 as it's enshrined in the Constitution. We continue to be opposed. Many of you will have seen in your email boxes a action alert to send your letter to the governor and to your legislator, sharing your opposition to the withholding. That action alert has been updated to reflect this newer number. We still encourage folks to respond to the action alert. We will be providing updates about that. If you haven't found that email, we will send another one because I know many folks don't get enough emails from us. But we will certainly encourage everybody to respond to that because the school board member voice on these issues is critical. So I'm going to pause here for just a quick moment. We're going to transition now into specific proposals by the governor. These are outside of, well, within Prop 98 as a whole. But we will jump into these here and talk about where things sit in relation to what has changed from the governor's January proposals. And so back in January, you will remember we got a surprise announcement from the governor that he was proposing to essentially reform how some major elements of how the public education governance system is structured. The governor proposed in January that he was going to shift all the statutory responsibilities and basically the administrative responsibilities, oversight responsibilities of the state superintendent from the state superintendent to a newly created education commissioner that would be appointed by the governor. So this would essentially strip all of the authority that the state superintendent, a constitutional officer, right, a entity, a person that is elected by the voters to oversee public education in California, shift those responsibilities underneath a education commissioner who would then be answered to the State Board of Education and ultimately the governor. Now, remember that the governor actually currently appoints all 11 members of the State Board of Education. So this would essentially further concentrate that executive authority, that executive power over public education. CSBA has been actively engaged in the advocacy and discussions around this proposal. There are a number of things that have happened since then. One is to ensure that the education commissioner has demonstrable experience in actually running a large organization, either a private company or a nonprofit for that matter, or and has demonstrable experience in public education leadership. We're also continue to advocate for the education commissioner to be confirmable by the state Senate. So this is something that continues to be discussed. In the overall budget, you see a proposal that may revise to shift dollars from the Department of Education into a new office of the state superintendent because the state superintendent will still have a role to play. They are proposing that the state superintendent becomes a voting member of the State Board of Education, so would swap out one position on the state board for the state superintendent. I will flag that this is a step in the right direction. CSBA is in support of this effort because it speaks to the issue that we have been focusing on, which is our SOS for student achievement and the need for greater alignment at the state level, right? Greater, like I say, as you would say, defragmentation of a fragmented governance system. But again, we want that to be able to be reflective of the existing constructs of checks and balances. And so there is an effort in the legislature currently being pursued by Assemblymember David Alvarez out of San Diego to basically take the governor's proposal, move it out of the budget and put it into legislation so that becomes part of the policy discussion process. So right now we have a little bit of a juxtaposition here to look at, which is you have the governor pushing his proposal. He's pushing it through the budget process, but the legislature is saying, hey, hold on a second. We really think this needs greater attention and we need to dive into the details much more specifically. So we're going to pursue this legislation. So it remains to be seen whether or not the governor's proposal will be enshrined in the May revar in the final budget, or if it will be pulled out of the budget and then the discussions will focus on the legislation. So that will be something that we will continue to monitor. And I'm going to now kick it over to my colleague Carlos to jump into the two block grants.
Thanks, Chris. So some of these will look very familiar to you. We've seen these block grants in the past. So on the first block grants, you may remember that last year there was a professional development discretionary block grant to the tune of about $1.9 billion. And in the May revise, we saw the creation of a new discretionary block grant. The change from the May revise is that it's been upped to $5 billion. So we've seen a significant increase here. That's going to be about, if it's based upon equal distribution, it would be about $800 per ADA. At issue here, which is what we saw from last year's discretionary block grant and this year, and the one proposed this year, is that there are some priorities that are identified here that you must first use these dollars to pay for these programs. So there is some limitation on actual discretion here, but there is a significant increase that we see in the May revise towards this proposal. And
if I could, Carlos, I'll just add on here real fast that the governor wants folks to prioritize the use of this discretionary block grant for these kind of sub bullets here on professional development and recruitment and retention, but also then does permit the amounts to be used for growing operational costs. So it does balance that discretionary aspect, but it just has this included language of saying kind of, please, let's try to have you focus this money there. But again, at the end of the day, it still does provide that flexibility for districts. Apologies for jumping in.
Yeah, and thanks, Chris. And I will add that that was one of the concerns that CSBA and others had raised with legislators and policymakers, that that discretion was limited, but with the increased funding, it does help provide for LAs to use that money for other priorities as well. So moving on to the second item here. During the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant was a program that's created during the pandemic. This block grant has undergone a couple of cuts after its implementation. And so like last year, now this year again, we're seeing that the governor has proposed restoring those cuts to the tune of about $757 million. That was indicated in the January proposed budget. It's maintained again in the May revise. So as this is restored, it will trigger the reporting and compliance requirements that come with the Learning Recovery Emergency Block Grant requirements. So just wanted you to be aware of that as well. Next slide, please. So here we want to highlight a couple of proposals that would benefit county offices. The first is that county offices are going to receive an additional ADA support under the May revise. The revise includes roughly $48 million for this purpose. As noted here, the so-called super COLA applies to this item too. And then on the second item, wanted to highlight that the May revise includes the January proposal of $13.3 million for county offices of education for universal and targeted assistance. And this is largely due to the advocacy efforts of the California County Superintendents with strong support from CSBA. And then on a related item, differentiated assistance eligibility criteria is currently under review at the State Board of Education, and they're expected to make changes or approve changes to those criteria at their July meeting. Next slide. Necessary small schools. This proposal carries over from January to provide additional funding to increase necessary small school LCFF base rates by 20%. It's only at $31 million, but it's a pretty significant increase percentage-wise. As you know, necessary small school districts are elementary schools with less than 97 ADA or high schools with 286 or less ADA. And they all face specific geographic factors. Huge benefit. This is a huge benefit for a lot of the small school districts and a lot of the rural school districts. And this was and continues to be a high priority for CSBA. And now I'll kick it over to Marissa for special ed.
Thanks, Carlos. Good morning, everyone. Excited to share some updates that are happening in the special education space. So the May revise significantly expands the governor's January proposal. The administration was proposing initially in January to increase special education funding for $509 million and raise that total to $2.4 billion ongoing. This reflects an additional $1.9 billion increase above the governor's January budget proposal, and the focus is on the base rate. So the base rate as of May would increase the special education funding to $1,340 per student, and this represents approximately a 43% increase from the 2025 budget level. California special education base funding rate is in the low $900 per student, and it's distributed through California's AB 602 formula, which allocates funding primarily based on average daily attendance rather than the number of students identified for special education services. The funds then flow through the SELPAs, the special education local plan areas, to school districts and LEAs and charters. So this is a major win, but want to emphasize that CSBA is still fighting the fight at the state and federal level because the feds have not met their obligations of committing adequate funds for that 40% in excess costs. And unfortunately, schools in California and LEAs and county offices of ed are still having to work on this unfortunate challenge. But we are trying to bring this level and coordinated in our state and federal advocacy efforts. Want to also note the governor, the legislature and the governor are both interested in more inclusive actions. The May revise includes $25 million one-time funding for the inclusive college technical assistance centers, and fundings would support expansion of inclusive post-secondary education opportunities, technical assistance and capacity building, and programs serving students receiving special education services transitioning into higher education and workforce pathways. I'll hand it over to Chris.
There we go. There, I got my mute off. Always a challenge in Zoom. So this is the caveat that Dan had mentioned when we talked about the Super Cola. So in a little bit of a surprise, this is language that was included in the May revise that would essentially require all LEAs, all school districts and county offices of education, to provide 14 weeks of paid pregnancy disability for all staff. This has been something that's been pursued legislatively over the last number of years. CSBA, did have serious concerns with the legislation, mostly from a funding perspective, it being kind of an unfunded mandate, if you will. This appears to be an effort to, further accomplish this goal. This is a unique way, a little bit of an unorthodox way of using COLA to pay for a mandate, and so I want to really emphasize and note that this is a new way or new approach to how a COLA is being provided. And so from the construct of the super COLA, or the idea of a super COLA, is that additional piece will be required to pay for these costs. The Department of Finance is putting these costs at about $218 million statewide. And this will also depend on uptake and the number of days that are taken and what that means going forward. It is, again, just an estimate. It could be higher, but this is an area of concern where the state is trying to add additional items that then have first call on the COLA. The COLA, as everyone knows, right, is about just the overall cost of increase in running school districts. And so these are not about increase of these types of mandates, if you will, or different categorical programs. It is just about trying to provide additional dollars to support operational costs as it relates to inflation and other impacts. So this is an area of concern to point out, and as it relates to more of the precedent-setting nature of how the state is addressing increases in the COLA and potentially going forward as well. So I'm going to now bump it back over to Carlos to talk to us about literacy.
Thanks, Chris. So on the first item here, there's about 430 million that's proposed for the literacy coaches and reading specialists grant program. The program provides funding for eligible LEAs to develop school literacy programs, employ and train literacy coaches and reading and literacy specialists, and develop and implement interventions for pupils in need of targeted literacy support. This will extend support to some LEAs by as much as 4 years. So this is helpful to see that additional support going forward. There's also 11.2 million for literacy coaches under the literacy coaches and reading specialists education training competitive grants. And then lastly, 5 million is proposed for the multitude screening tool to expand access to more LEAs and make this tool available in more languages. Next slide, please. And then moving on to math, we're seeing $60 million proposed for the Mathematics Professional Learning Partnership. This partnership builds capacity for mathematics coaching, training, and leadership so that all students have access to high quality mathematics instruction going forward. And then pass it back to Chris for this slide.
So, in some welcome news, we are seeing a continued effort in the budget to provide additional funds to support districts and county offices in what we're seeing on the ground level, which is the unprecedented staffing shortage. As many of you might recall, during the pandemic, there was a substantial amount of one-time monies put into the budget that was basically spread out over a period of 5 years. A lot of that funding is expiring now that we're 5 years out from that investment. Though we continue to see, some additional investment of dollars, which is here. The $30 million is that you see in the top bullet here is kind of being spread out among a number of different programs that provide both additional recruitment services as well as professional development. So kind of the recruitment and retention aspects of that theme. And again, we continue to see an emphasis on a kind of grow your own educator programs. So these are where districts and counties have their own credentialing program, or they're partnering with local colleges of education, and even developing some CTE-oriented kind of academy-based approaches to a grow your own teacher recruitment programs. Still remains to be seen how many of the programs will see these additional dollars. We will provide that information later on as we get more details and dive through what is called the budget trailer bill. There is also, again, a recognition of the growing challenges that we're facing in the special ed field and the loss of special ed teachers. You see this kind of redirection of 16.2 million in ongoing IDA funding to provide these $20,000 grants. This will be done through the Golden State Teacher Grant Program, a program that was stood up about 5 years ago and has been very, very popular and has basically those funds have been historically exhausted every year that there's additional dollars provided. We also see this additional 1.6 million through kind of some Title II funds to provide additional $10,000 grants via that particular grant program. And of course, we have some additional pieces here on greater supports of how folks can get access to not just professional development, but also streamlining the process by which candidates can get a credential. You might recall that during the pandemic, in lieu of in-person examinations through doing the CBEST or the CSET examinations, the basic educational skills assessment, as well as the subject matter expertise assessments that candidates could submit their college transcripts to be able to meet those requirements in lieu of taking the exam. There is some additional dollars here being provided to the Commission on Teacher Credentialing to develop kind of a module by which candidates can submit their syllabi and their transcripts, if you will, to be able to examine and further streamline how and whether or not that the college experience would automatically meet the CSET requirements. And so that is another aspect of kind of expediency and maybe kind of quick review of the credentialing candidates. Then you have this additional piece of some revenues aspect. They are increasing the renewal fee for teachers, the 5-year credentialing renewal fee from $100 to $125. Some of you might be aware that the CTC, although is funded in part by some Prop 98 dollars, it was some state general fund, they do receive quite a bit of their operational dollars through professional fees that are submitted by teachers. They're a licensing agency, so they do get quite a bit of those operational resources for that purpose, and you're seeing that and reflected here. And now I'm going to jump over to our community schools grant program and ask Marissa to come back on.
Thanks, Chris. So the May revise is proposing to redirect $485 million from the existing California Community Schools Partnership Program into a broader structure statewide. This supports the governor's proposal to create a $1 billion ongoing Prop 98 community schools grant program to expand the community school model. And this signals a move from one-time limited grant program funding to a more permanent statewide funding structure for community schools. I also want to break into that $485 million and what it means. $401 million ongoing grants would support planning and implementation of new and expanding community schools and focus on building foundational systems like wraparound services, governance structures, and community partnerships. $50 million would expand existing efforts to redesign middle and high schools, emphasis on integrating academic, behavioral, and community-based supports. $15 million as part of state transformational assistance centers would provide technical assistance for new community schools and supports implementation, guidance, coaching, and statewide coordination. $13 million as additional technical assistance support to assist community school grant recipients with implementation challenges and capacity building. And then that's $6 million for county office and community collaboration to create that greater coordination that's happening at the local level, as well as with community partners, and streamline that local implementation. And on the next slide, I'll be getting in, and if Chris wants to jump in a bit on the ELOP program, the May revise maintains the governor's January budget proposal to increase funding for ELOP, and this includes an additional $62.4 million in ongoing Prop 98 general funds. The total ELOP funding reaches approximately $4.7 billion Prop 98 ongoing funds. And I see Chris on the screen, so I'll hand it to him.
I just like to point out here, we did some math for everybody to kind of calculate what would this mean in terms of cost to overall funding. ELOP being $4.7 billion ongoing of $98 is basically equivalent to about $876 per pupil, roughly, based upon what current enrollment looks like. That is significant. ELOP, yes, it has been a good program for a number of folks. I'll just flag that these are funds that are ostensibly being used for an after-school program that are really intended for the core instructional day. And so from that perspective, when we're talking about the challenges that many districts are facing, especially our base grant funded districts, those districts that do not receive supplemental concentration grant funding, imagine what you could do if this 4.7 was invested into the LCFF base.
Thanks, Chris. Also want to get into some other elements to call out, like the Universal School Meals Program. The May revise includes $2.8 million ongoing general fund, Prop 98 general funds to fully support the Universal Meals Program. And this ensures continued statewide implementation of breakfast and lunch for all students at no cost and stabilizes funding for meal program operations. We also want to call out the McKinney-Vento supports for homeless youth and youth obviously experiencing homelessness. This is $30 million one-time Prop 98 general funds, and this is to supplement existing McKinney-Vento children and youth grants. We want to strengthen access to transportation, enrollment stability, as well as basic need supports like school supplies and greater coordination. And then other notable elements includes the 265.6 million for general funds for LEAs due to decreased offsetting property, additional support for Holocaust and genocide education, and 10 million in one-time Prop 98 general funds. We know that this has been a big topic the last few years and presently in the legislature, and then that 1.7 million in additional ongoing Prop 98 general funds for mandated menstrual products. And I'll hand it off to Patrick.
Great. So the major takeaways from what is the governor's last May revise. We are possibly in an AI bubble. AI has generated a significant amount of revenue. The question is that revenue sustainable? So we need to be cautious, of course, because again, we may be in a bubble, we may not. The budget is largely balanced, but deficits are on the horizon in future years. Okay. The manipulation of Proposition 98 remains, and I really want people to remember this. The governor is manipulating Proposition 98, and it has the potential this year, and in fact in future years, to ensure that Proposition 98 receives less dollars. So we really need to push back on this manipulation. You're going to likely see action alerts from us. Troy is going to be talking about something he's going to be working on in short order to raise awareness to the legislature and to the governor about this manipulation, and that it's really a bad thing. So if you come across any of your state legislators, make sure you bring up the budget manipulation. The manipulation of Proposition 98 is a bad thing. Okay? No one can rewrite the Constitution. Okay, they need to apply the Constitution as written and has been practiced in past years. So again, a very problematic, the manipulation of Proposition 98. Fragmented governance remains. CSBA continues our SOS for Student Achievement campaign. Okay? So take note of that, and you've probably seen some emails on that topic. To our next slide. Okay, our 26-27 May revision budget workshops are coming up very shortly. They'll be starting next week and moving through the early part of June. Please attend them. We conduct these in partnership with Capital Advisors and some other folks you'll see on the screen right there. And to learn more, you can just click on the link right there. Back to you, Troy.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you to all our advocates for providing that analysis of the May revised proposal. And to second what Patrick said, we are remaining very engaged in advocacy to shape what the final budget will be. And we've also joined with some of our other statewide education association and labor unions in a somewhat rare show of unified force, which really underscores how much of a transgression we feel that the $3.9 billion withholding is. And it's not strictly about the dollar amount. Even if the withholding were only $1, it would be unacceptable because that would be a violation of voter-approved Proposition 98, which is enshrined in the Constitution. And it would essentially be a stalking horse, which is trying to change the precedent and set the stage for Prop 98 to become discretionary instead of mandatory. And that opens up all sorts of problems for down the road if you have a governor who would like to undermine and hollow out Prop 98. So we can't allow the way that this voter-approved constitutional law is being treated and being seen here in California. And so with that in mind, all of the statewide labor unions and management and parent and governance organizations are gathering on the west steps of the Capitol this Thursday, May 21st at 10 a.m. for a public event to condemn the governor's proposal to remove or withhold $3.9 billion from the proposed 26-27 May budget. So we are really drawing the line there, and we will keep our membership informed on any developments as we go forward. And so with that, let's move to the questions. And one question we always get that I want to address is that we will be sending a recording of this presentation as well as a copy of the slide deck out to everybody who has registered. So if you didn't catch everything or you know someone who didn't watch this live, they can still get the core information that they need to understand what's happening in their district as regards the May revise and hopefully to participate in the advocacy to achieve a favorable result for public schools here in California. The first question we received is, can you provide estimated amounts of CCSPP funds that will be received by current CCSPP school sites and the amount for new schools that apply for CCSPP funds?
Thanks, Troy. Under the governor's proposal, amounts would range based on enrollment span. So if you had 10 to 24 enrollment at a school site, you'd be looking at 75,000. On the high end, if you had 2,000 plus students enrolled at your school site, it would be 400,000. So somewhere in that range. I'm going to try and put the table in chat, but I worry a little bit about the formatting here.
And I'll just say, just for clarification, so folks know what the question is referring to, CCSPP stands for the California Community Schools Partnership Program. This is the Community Schools Program that has been kind of a little bit of a priority for the governor in the last number of budget years, including this year.
Thank you, Dan and Chris. Next, we have a request to provide the estimated amount of KIT or KIT funds schools can expect under the May revise.
And KIT funds, KIT is an acronym for the Kitchen Infrastructure and Training Grant. So I'm not sure if we have an actual breakdown, but Dan, I think you can help provide a little bit more context.
Yes. So this was originally proposed as a competitive grant. That requirement is struck. And so now it would be determined on a formula that would be calculated by CDE. So I don't have what those numbers actually work out to be, but the guardrails are that every eligible school site gets a base grant, but then additional funding for schools with high free and reduced price meals. So kind of like a supplemental and concentration grant, if you will. What those numbers work out to are going to depend on the final CDE calculation, though.
And when Dan refers to CDE, apologies, we're talking about the California Department of Education. We as advocates always fall victim to the world of acronyms.
The next member is asking the GR staff to get out their crystal balls and predict how likely it is that these numbers will be finally adopted in the June 2026 budget.
It's a good question, and it's a question, right, we get all the time. Just a couple of things I'll point out here is obviously this is the governor's May revise. This is his revision to the January budget. So these are revising his proposals, his priorities as he exits stage left due to term limits. Fundamentally, what's going to happen here in the next number of weeks is that this proposal, the May revise, will now go to the legislature. The legislature will basically begin in earnest. There's actually hearings scheduled this week to start to review their budget, and this is where the legislature is going to respond and provide their response to the May revise. So these are essentially, we're going to really accelerated negotiations between the legislature, the state senate, and the state assembly, and with the governor. The legislature has until June 15th to pass a balanced budget, and then the governor has until June 30th to sign it. And so the answer remains to be seen. A number of these proposals could change. Again, we are fully opposed to the withholding, the Prop 98 withholding of 3.9 billion. If we are successful, which I hope we will be, we will see some of these numbers change. So, just be prepared and stay in touch with your GR team. We're happy to provide feedback and updates on where things stand.
Thanks, Chris. What is the difference between the maintenance factor being fully repaid and the Prop 98 withholding of $3.9 billion?
Another good question. So, and I'm gonna, Dan, jump in here as well if I miss anything. But when the state is unable to fully fund Prop 98, there's a mechanism in the Constitution enshrined in Prop 98 called suspension. And the way suspension works is that they basically suspend the guarantee. It's basically say, hey, I owe you $100, but I really can only pay for $98, right? So I'm going to suspend what I owe you by $2. And that $2 becomes maintenance factor, or is basically a fancy term for debt. A couple of things to keep in mind. One is Prop 98 can only be suspended in the year in which the suspension occurs. So if they suspend, they have to suspend for the current year. If they want to suspend for the 26-27 fiscal year, they have to wait until next year to do so. Essentially, although suspension has only happened 3 times in roughly the 39-year history of Prop 98, um, 30, maybe 38-year history, um, it is not something that we want the legislature to become comfortable with. So it does come with a little bit of a caveat there. But if they do suspend, that debt becomes owed to us over time and is paid back on a formula-based structure. Dan alluded to this earlier on the Prop 98 slide as it related to the maintenance factor, where when state general fund revenues come back higher than expected, first call on those dollars is to repay suspension maintenance factor to CBO if that occurs. So that said, the difference between what a suspension is and what a withholding is that the way the withholding would work is I'm going to withhold, for example, that $100 example I gave, right? I'm going to withhold that $2, and I'm going to pay you back that $2 next year if I have the money to do that. The construct here is if we lay in AI, the impact that AI is having on the substantial growth of our state revenues, and a bubble pops in the AI world, if you will I have that $2 to pay you back next year? Then what happens? So in essence, that is a underfunding of Prop 98 and actually is under what the guarantee would be. And so the question is, will districts and will schools, will county offices, will public education get that money back? The question really is unknown, and that is what is of great concern because this can create a new loophole within Prop 98, and that's where we're concerned the precedent sits. Dan, jump in if I missed anything.
No, I think Chris got it. Just a couple of fine details in here that make this matter. Maintenance factor basically accrues interest. This withholding would not. As Chris said, the idea that what happens if they can't pay us back, and you may think, well, I thought that was guaranteed. I thought that funding was supposed to have maybe been set aside. That's not what's happening. The governor is basically saying, I'm going to take this almost $4 billion because I have bills I need to pay on the non-98 side of the budget, and I'm going to use that to cover them. So it's kind of like a loan from schools to cover other programs with the thought that, oh yeah, it should probably be repaid next year. But if we now have sudden spikes and I guess spikes in the deficit, so a huge deficit, or just spikes in use on the non-98 side of the budget, and there's not free money to then make that repayment, then what happens? And that's why it gets into this whole unknown. And even the Department of Finance has floated the idea of, well, maybe you're paid back, but over a longer period of time with a schedule that gets set. And that's, again, that starts to undermine the entire purpose of 98.
Right. Ultimately, it's called the Prop 98 guarantee for a reason. And if you're not definitely 100% getting the money, then it's not a guarantee. And we're undermining the very principle of this school funding foundation that we've been working on for over 40 years. The next question is about SSPD funds. What is the effective use of one-time SSPD funds for operational costs?
And so this question has to do with the Student Support and Professional Development Discretionary Block Grant. This is, again, the second such proposal of a grant. As you might recall, last year's budget proposed a similar discretionary block grant. I believe it ended up being 2.7, Dan. This year, the governor proposes for it to be 2.8 in January. It's now being increased to 5 billion overall. These are one-time monies that can be used for discretionary operational costs. And so the governor and the legislature has included language that says it encourages districts and county offices to use this money to provide additional student support services, professional development opportunities related to math, English language learner, English language professional development, as well as some CTE programs and the like. But effectively, it is fully discretionary as it relates to paying for your operational costs. That said, just want to emphasize this. This is one-time money. So you be mindful of how your district is going to use this money on an ADA basis and use it for one-time costs, not ongoing costs. Want to encourage districts to really take that into account, that these is not intended, should not be used for ongoing costs, because you will find that when that money runs out, you are now in a potential place of being in a deficit. And so these are one-time costs of, say, infrastructure improvements, retention bonuses, other things that are other districts have used the discretionary block grant in the past as examples. Definitely then of course is something that CSBA has been supportive of in terms of deferring that discretion to districts so that you ultimately have that flexibility in how you use those dollars. So I know it's a lot of repetition of a lot of flexibility, but yes, it is discretionary one time.
And I
Dan?
would just add to that, and this speaks to an upcoming question, as far as how likely are schools to actually see that funding? How likely is that discretionary block grant and the full $5 billion to be included in the final budget? There are certain voices in the legislature that do not like this, and partly it's because they see it as if we give you this large pot of one-time funding, you're going to use it to make ongoing commitments, and then it actually decreases your fiscal stability. So just know that that is out there. That is a perspective that we are trying to counter, but it is at least a couple of voices I can think of off the top of my head.
Great. The next question involves teacher recruitment and retention and how that intersects with the block grant. Teacher recruitment and retention requires higher salaries and increased ongoing benefits. These things can't be done with one-time block grants. But our labor partners see this and demand it in the form of salary and benefits increases. This language in the block grant hurts districts during bargaining. Any chance to remove this language from the block grant so it's clear that it can only be used on one-time expenditures?
So it is something that we can, make note of. I will just emphasize that although the block grant does say that the money is encouraged to be used for these particular purposes, it does not mandate that they be used for those purposes. In the language of the block grant is a reference to growing operational costs. So basically, it's, hey, please spend this money on these four items, but it may also be used for growing operational costs, and that thus making the grant fully discretionary. Removing that language, I'll just be frank, that is unlikely. This continues to be an area of focus for the governor. You heard, if you listen to the governor's proposal of the May revise, he has been, talking about some of these transformational, investments that the state has made during his time period, and in speaking to the governor's legacy as he exits, stage left due to his being termed out of office. I anticipate that the governor's office will want to continue to keep that specific language in the block grant.
Thank you. The next question for special ed section, is this encompassing programs like IEPs? So referring to the $2.4 billion ongoing special ed funding increase.
Thanks, Troy. Yep. And the short answer is yep, you got it. Under AB 602, special education funding is designed to support districts, especially with this aspect of the services required under the IEPs. So short answer is yes, but want to call out that funds are not allocated per individual IEP, and they're distributed from the state to the SELPA to the districts and then the programs and services. And the allocation is primarily based on the average daily attendance, not the number or cost of IEPs.
Great. Very helpful. Thank you, Marissa. The next question is about the leave provision in the proposal. Is pregnancy disability leave the same as maternity leave? Can it be used post-birth or only during pregnancy?
So the structure of this is a recognition that many teachers don't pay into the state disability insurance fund. And so the intent of this is to provide parity to that type of benefit, though we recognize that many districts do negotiate pregnancy leave, maternity leave with their collective bargaining units. This would be on top of that. And so from that perspective, it will substantially expand and add to that type of leave available to districts, available to teachers and staff.
I would add that the trailer bill language that's out on this, it's pretty specific to an employee who either is pregnant or was previously pregnant, whether it was fully completed or a miscarriage or something like that. So kind of recovering therefrom. So that kind of limits the pool of employees who could avail themselves of this benefit. It also does specifically say, as Chris noted, this does not restrict whatever you may have negotiated either. So that can be on top of or in addition to.
Thank you. On the COLA, does the so-called super COLA, and I'm actually going to try and get away from that terminology, a little bit misleading when you consider its inadequacy compared to the rising costs, as well as the fact that some of the COLA is earmarked for specific funds. But does the COLA in the governor's May revise fund extended parental leave, and does it have reporting requirements related to the funding of extended parental leave?
I cannot find a reporting requirement for the allocation or in the pregnancy leave program. So it does not appear that that's there at the moment.
But I will note that when we've seen these types of proposals in the past, this does come up in the construct of auditing. So when there's, as some of you might know, there is a statewide audit guide that is developed and amended regularly to update as it relates to funding changes and other requirements. This could be something that could appear in an audit guide at a later date to require districts to specify what percentage of this change in COLA is being paid, is being allocated to or to pay and cover the growth of or the provision of pregnancy disability leave.
The next question, is the math allocated based on ADA, or is it a competitive grant for small LCFF districts? Sorry, the mathematics funding, is that allocated based on ADA, or is it a competitive grant for small LCFF districts?
So, Troy, I can take that one. So, in the 2025-26 Omnibus Education Trailer Bill, there was a requirement. In that budget, there was 30 million that was allocated. And part of the requirements of that 30 million was that the Kern County Superintendent of Schools was required to submit an expenditure plan on behalf of the Mathematics Professional Learning Partnership. And so what you're seeing with the 60 million proposed in the May revise is to fund that expenditure plan. And the purpose of that funding is to provide educator training and resources related to mathematics, and that'll be available statewide. It's so that funding is going to go to Kern County Superintendent for these purposes.
Thank you, Carlos. The next question concerns ELOP. Universal ELOP has been transformative for our district. How likely is it that ELOP funding might decrease under a new governor? And you've been very good about doing this, Chris, but explain for those who don't know what ELOP funding is.
ELOP is the Expanded Learning Opportunities Program. It was created during as kind of during the pandemic, if you will, coming out of the pandemic. The intent of the program was to provide kind of intensive tutoring, high caliber, content oriented after school programs to help students recover from the lost learning opportunities that they experienced during the pandemic. It is, like I said, a substantial amount of funding that was allocated in ongoing Prop 98 dollars for this purpose. Really, it remains to be seen. I understand what I had said earlier might have caused some concern with some folks, especially those who are using the money in very effective ways. Completely recognize that, though at the same time, in terms of the challenges that districts are facing going forward with the growing costs of district operations, a LCFF that is not keeping with those costs. It is a program that I think some have raised concerns about. That said, will it continue? It remains to be seen who is going to be the next governor. The legislature is changing, as on every 2 years, and so the guess is, kind of one of these crystal ball, kind of guesses. One thing I will say is that ELOP, the ELOP program or the Expanding Learning Opportunities Program, is a legacy program of the governor. And so this is something of a priority for, Governor Newsom. And I know we've all kind of have acknowledged that one of the worst kept secrets is that Governor Newsom is interested in running for president in 2028. And so it being a legacy and him wanting to run for governor or run for president, those are, some aspects that will be taken into account in terms of the existence and maintenance of a legacy program of the governor.
So here's a question going back to Prop 98. Why increase the per pupil funding but borrow from Prop 98? Can't the governor just use that money instead of taking it from Prop 98?
So when the governor talks about highest per pupil funding ever, it does sound like that has been a choice to allocate a larger amount of funding to schools, and that's actually not the case. It's Prop 98 requires that a certain percentage or a certain dollar value goes to school funding each year. And just naturally, as the state's revenue picture has kind of surged post-COVID, then therefore so has Prop 98. So and then this is part of the whole issue with the withholding. There isn't a choice to allocate less. It's a guarantee. So he has to allocate that per pupil funding. And then due to some of the other mechanisms in the state budget and in state law, the governor kind of feels this pinch of, well, I have to give you this dollar, but I have cost pressures over here that I really want to take care of. And the same students that we're serving every day is in the schools, they are going to be the same families who are going to benefit from a lot of social services that are pretty costly and that have experienced a lot of defunding at the federal level. So it's not a choice of, I could just increase school funding less. That would blatantly violate 98. It is kind of competing interest revenues that aren't where they need to be for what the desire of services is on the 998 side and a few other things.
Thanks, Dan.
And
Patrick, did you want to hop in here?
yeah, please. And I just want people to know what the governor is creating here. Okay, with the manipulation of 98 potentially is a tool that can be used in the out years. Yes, he's using it this year. Okay. Uh, Several billion dollars this year, but it could grow next year to be much more. It could grow in the out years to be much, much more. Okay. As has been shared, there's a mechanism. If you cannot afford to pay schools what they're owed, you suspend 98, you build a maintenance factor. He's driving around that. Okay. And as some of the folks probably in finance are looking ahead, they're seeing major deficits. They want a tool. Okay. And this is the tool they would use. Certainly they want to employ it this year, but also in the out years to not give 98 the dollars it is deserved of. Thank you.
The next question goes back to what we are no longer calling the super cola. Instead of taking money from the scare quote super cola, give us a restricted dollar to pay for this. Pay us the year after the expense. This will be very difficult to budget for. Also, the language says pregnancy disability. Does this mean they need a doctor's note?
So I'll just jump in. All good points. Definitely speaks to the complexity of how this will be implemented and how it will be, maintained, if you will, going forward, recognizing that's a COLA that's going to be enshrined within kind of within LCFF per se. In terms of the doctor's note, Dan, I saw you turn your screen on, so you can definitely jump in if you like, but essentially, it does act as a disability function, so not dissimilar to state disability insurance. So Dan, I don't know if you want to illuminate more on that one.
The timing and length of leave would be in conjunction with the physician, so very much you would need some kind of doctor's note.
Thank you for clarifying that. The next question is about small school districts. What is being done for small school districts over 96 students but under 250 students?
Well, so I'll take that and take you one further. What is being done for small school districts that are 2,500 ADA or less? Under statute, a small school district is defined as a district that has less than 2,500 ADA. They represent 58% of our school districts in California, about 454 out of 940, and serve very great territories and vast areas, and face a lot of unique challenges, economies of scale, and so forth. So CSBA continues to advocate for increases in base grants, less reporting requirements, greater efficiencies and support for our smalls, Yes, the additional dollars for these necessary small schools is a step in the right direction, but by no means is a reflection of that we're stopping there. We continue to advocate for increased funding for our smalls and greater supports in variety of fashions. In the past, we have pursued efforts to remove the administrator to teacher ratio cap, as it inhibits the ability of small school districts to be able to hire additional administrative staff to help serve students. We've tried to pursue additional accommodations and offices that can help provide direct assistance to small school districts, including legislation to create an Office of Small School District Office of Small School District Facilities and Construction in the Department of Education, recognizing that smalls face more unique challenges than their medium and larger counterparts, especially as it relates to accessing bond dollars and so forth. So all of these efforts are tantamount to the ongoing advocacy that CSBA does to provide additional supports for our small school districts, 2,588 or less.
So I think we did touch on the answer to the next question, but for clarity, we'll revisit. Since the 14-week pregnancy leave is being funded by the Super Cola, does that mean in years with no Super Cola, funding districts won't be required to give the 14-week paid leave?
No, that's not what that means. So the COLA increases the LCFF base grant, so then that money goes forward into future years. So this is a ongoing mandate. This is not a 1 year mandate. This is a continual mandate that will be required of your LCFF dollars. Dan, I don't know if you want to add a little bit more flavor there, but that it is an ongoing cost that will be enshrined within the LCFF that's beyond the auspices and requirements of LCFF as it currently stands.
Could I just add something, Troy? And my compliments to the person that asked that question. They caught it. What the governor is doing is he's saying, hey, here's a new program you're going to have to implement and take it out of your COLA. Well, let's just say any future governor couldn't say, hey, there's no higher than average COLA. In fact, there's very minimal COLA. But hey, here's a new program. Pay for it out of the small COLA. So it's very problematic, this venture of assigning programs to COLA dollars. So you picked up on that.
Another question about COLA. We are in negotiations with our labor organizations. With the increase in COLA and the addition of the Super COLA, is it safe to assume we have about 0.5% more to play with?
I would just say the COLA isn't your COLA. You have your unique situation with what is your enrollment doing. Like, if it's declining, your net COLA may be much lower than what the state's projecting. So a lot of other factors would be at play there that you need to consider to determine what's safe. And I can't answer that without knowing those specific factors.
And if I may, Troy, as one who sat on a bargaining team for 15 years on the teacher's side, and quite frankly, wasn't educated much on the implications of COLA. You need to realize that every percent of increase to your salary schedule is probably about 1.3, 1.4%. Okay. It's not the COLA's a 1% in COLA doesn't necessarily equate to a 1% in raise as far as the costs go. So you want to be very careful when you're at the bargaining table, because remember, when you increase salaries too, so too does your PERS on the classified side, your STIRS on the certificated side, your Social Security on the classified side, and other factors too. So there's a number of drivers when you're talking about even a 1% raise at the table. And you should educate your bargaining team as to what those costs are. Your CDO should be sitting down and walking through the actual implications of any increase to the salary schedule.
Thank you. Sticking with the COLA, community-funded schools are not receiving the Super COLA. Are we still required to provide the 14 weeks of paid pregnancy leave? And what new funds will support this requirement?
This is the challenge for basic aid districts. The way the statute reads is that a public school employer shall provide this benefit. It's very similar to, I would say, TK. And so then it's a question of how do you roll that out when you're not receiving additional funding? So that is a challenge that we are aware of, and have long advocated for issues around funding for these additional mandates for that purpose. But that is as it currently reads.
And I'll add that this is always a construct within LCFF, that as LCFF grows, and if it does, yes, this COLA is higher than usual, but it does increase. So for those of our districts who are what we kind of refer to as fence sitters, right, where you're close to being an LCFF district, but you're community funded one year and you can fall back in the next year based upon what LCFF is. This is where the construct really becomes challenging, especially for our fence sitting districts that can fall in and out of LCFF and being community funded on any given year. So it only exacerbates some of the challenges that many of those are of those community funded districts or basic aid districts that they face.
Thank you. So just for complete clarity, all districts and COEs are responsible for the leave, correct?
So as of right now, based upon what the language we've seen out of the governor's office and in the trailer bill, yes, it applies to all school districts and county office of education. The question is whether or not this gets modified or changed in that trailer bill language. So again, remember that, and this goes for all the questions that we're answering here. These are all proposals, right? So whether or not these end up in the final budget remains to be seen. But again, these are all areas of concern that, of course, CSBA, your government relations team, will be advocating for and raising as those negotiations go forward over the next 4 weeks.
Thank you, Chris. Shifting gears to federal, so perhaps Marissa or Patrick will weigh in here. Are federal funds for California under threat from the current administration?
Thanks, Troy. I want to start off with a little bit of good news before we get into the heavier news. So the president released last month his fiscal year 2027 proposal for the budget. This is just a framework. It's not law. It's nothing in stone. It's a starting place for Congress to react to, negotiate, and finalize through the process by October 1. So the wins in this space is the maintaining of Title I grant, so that 18.4 from last year, 18.4 billion will continue. But do want to call out there's a $2 billion new proposal for Make Education Great Again. It will consolidate 17 existing programs, and some of the programs I want to call out is 1.3 billion for before and after school programs, 129 million for homeless youth, specifically McKinney-Vento, and 25 million for literacy programs. These are just a couple that come top of mind. And so while they're being consolidated, there are concerns now that by giving more quote unquote flexibility to states, will these dollars then be going to the targeted programs and students that they were once serving? So that's something that is of major concern and what we're following. In the special ed space, there was actually an increase that will be 16 billion for IDEA programs. So that's a common theme we're seeing in terms of additional funds for SPED at the federal and state level. And also want to call out the president is proposing to cut significant dollars. I think it's 1.3 billion for English language acquisition and migrant education programs. So complete elimination, 890 million for ELA, 428 million for migrant education, and then some professional development programs that go along with that, as well as 50 million cut to comprehensive centers. So we are definitely figuring out our engagement in that space and protection, because especially for schools that have a high percentage of students that are ELA and migrant ed, they're already facing pressures in terms of the school safety. I'll hand it over to Patrick if he has anything else in terms of the cuts that we're seeing and how this is going to play into our state strategy.
No, Marissa, you described it well. Top line is the governor's actually increasing IDA special ed funding by about $500 million, right around in that area. And Title I flat funded, and then a number of other programs cut or combined for what he's calling a mega grant, a Make Education Great Again grant. But again, there would be block grants, it appears in his proposal, but there would be fewer dollars for those services now provided through Department of Education funding. Now, last year at this point, the president's proposal was much more onerous. It was scary. It was a 26% cut in most funding. Now, through the machinations of the legislative process, really on the Senate side, a lot of that was held off. There weren't big increases, but a lot of the big cuts were held off. So this year, as we head into the process, we get into the summer, that's when the Senate and the House of Representatives come up with their own versions of how they want to conduct spending. Typically, the House, at least last year, the House very much mirrored the president's version. The Senate was the standalone and actually became the baseline right, to get it through because the Senate, remember, you need 60 votes in the Senate to get something up because of cloture of the filibuster. So we'll see where this all ends up. But as Marissa has shared, that the process has started, and please stay engaged on the federal level as well as the state level.
Next question for CCSPP. If we are currently a recipient of the one-time implementation 5-year grant, will the new ongoing $1 billion come into effect before the 5 years expires or after the 5 years? And will it have the same funding level?
And just before Dan jumps in here with the answer, just as a reminder, the CCSPP is the California Community Schools Partnership Program.
I was going to say that this time, Chris. So there is a provision with the new funding levels that I discussed earlier that I did put in chat that if you're a current recipient and you basically take your grant, divide it by 5 because it's a 5-year grant, you'll get the higher of whatever your grant is or the new funding levels. So if you have something below what those funding levels are for your school site enrollment, you would receive some additional funding for that program. If you're higher under the grant, you continue with that. And then once your grant ends at the end of its natural lifetime, then you'd want to switch over to this new program.
If we believe that the withholding from Prop 98 is unconstitutional and sets a bad precedent, are there plans to sue to enjoin it if the final budget contains this withholding? We don't have legal on this call, but we've been consistent since the withholding was first proposed in the governor's January budget proposal that if it eventually plays out as he has suggested, we will very likely sue. We can't say with 100% certainty until there's actual language. We have to see the actual text to respond to as the basis of a suit. But conceptually, based on what the governor is talking about and how we responded to previous withholdings when we did sue, we would follow that same path again. So that's the most likely outcome if the withholding remains in the final budget, which is not a given at all, considering the legislative versions of the budget do not include the withholding. But if by some unfortunate circumstance it did make its way into the final budget and the text looks like we expect it would, then yes, CSBA would probably litigate. I don't know if anybody wants to amplify that.
Troy, just may I jump on that as well? And you explained the situation well, but this is why advocacy is key. If we're going to get the legislature to reject the governor's manipulation of Proposition 98, okay, it requires advocacy. And certainly you have your team on here, and I think we do a pretty strong job inside the state capitol. But quite frankly, we need your voices on this issue. We need you advocating to your state senators, okay, and your assembly members to reject this budget manipulation. So right now we're in the political exercise because I can assure you, you walk around the Capitol, which I did this morning, there are groups out there in large numbers that are advocating for their cause. Okay? Their interest is not Proposition 98. Their interest lies elsewhere. So it's very important for us to engage on Proposition 98. So please watch out for action alerts and other efforts CSBA asks you to engage in to support the rejection of the budget manipulation.
Very right, Patrick. And I'll just take this time to mention again, we do have that press conference, not just CSBA, although CSBA has been the most aggressive on this issue, but the entire education coalition. That's parents, that's governance, that's management groups and labor unions coming together this Thursday, 10 a.m. at the Capitol steps to elevate this issue. But the action of these formal organizations only goes so far. We do need that groundswell of support from the membership to show the legislators that the people in their districts really care about this issue and it's a voting concern. That's what influences favorable action on behalf of schools. The next question asks, when does the pregnancy leave take effect?
And so, Troy, I see 3 questions here that are kind of all related to the pregnancy leave proposals. When does it take effect? Does it apply to either or both parents? And then there's also an additional question of why are teachers not part of the state disability insurance program? So if I could take all 3 together here, I'll start with when does it take effect? If it's included in the budget, it'll take effect in the coming fiscal year. So it'll come into effect in the 26-27 school year. So just heads up, everybody, it's coming. In terms of the our parents, either the father or the mother, or both guardians, or included. Yes, they are. But again, going back to the question about, doctor's note and other things, that it is a disability leave, and so you have to be able to demonstrate that it is a disability. More, so there are constructs there that will come with the aspects of the justification of that leave, which will be determined by your primary care physician potentially, of course, depending on how the details of the program are written out into Trailer Bill. On the question of why are teachers not in state disability insurance, most school districts, all school districts basically can opt into providing state disability leave, but most do not. Some do, some don't, some have versions. And so that is basically the fundamental reason why, which is then creates that, this argument of trying to create parity for those who can make it or are available to state disability insurance and those who are not.
Moving on to special education. With a proposed increase in state special education funding, how should districts evaluate the impact on their unrestricted general fund contribution and maintenance of effort requirements? Specifically, can districts reduce their local contribution while still remaining compliant with maintenance of effort expenditure thresholds?
Thanks, Troy. I want to give an overview to the MOE, maintenance of effort. So the maintenance of effort is a federal requirement under IDEA that requires LEAs to budget and expend at least the same level of state and local funds for special education services as the prior year, unless specific allowable exemptions have been applied. The short answer is no, you're still going to need to meet those MOE requirements. And those MOE is measured in two ways: the expenditure MOE, the spending level, and then the eligibility exception test for reductions. But I do want to note districts can qualify for a reduction or exemption and local contribution under federal MOE flexibility provisions. There's the 50% MOE reduction flexibility, and there's another exemption that's not a top of mind. My suggestion for you is that if you're going to do an evaluation, to conduct a year-over-year MOE comparison before adjusting any local contributions, as we know or don't know until the end of next month what the final budget will look like. And also in these evaluations, consider whether state increases cover actual cost increases or simply slow the growth of the deficit. Also consider coordinating with your SELPA fiscal teams before making budgeting shifts, and avoid assuming that any increase in funding means that you can actually reduce the local level. Again, this ties back into what we're advocating at the federal level. Recently joined a federal coalition called 40 for 40 that we really want to hold Congress's feet to the fire so that they meet their 40% commitment, because we're going to consistently run into this shortfall in the special education space. Thanks, Troy.
Thank you. Also, another question related to special education. IDEA funding is getting increased, but does Part B still have a portion earmarked for preschool, or did that get moved with no earmarks for preschool?
I'm curious on this. So I saw last week that Linda McMahon came out with 144, I think, million specifically for this early intervention space, but that was for fiscal year 2026. My understanding now is no, there's not going to be any earmarks for Part B in fiscal year 2027.
Thank you, Marissa. So back to the parental leave issue. Would the additional 12 weeks of parent bonding still be in effect? Would the 12 weeks be allowed on top of the new 14 weeks of paid leave?
So there we go. So to answer the question, one is it depends on what your bargaining agreement says. So just wanted to what you have already in place, and basically it would be on top of. So it could be more than the entire school year potentially, depending on how long. Well, maybe not the entire school year, but it would be the 12 weeks plus the on top of, which would be the 14 weeks would be layered on top potentially. But again, I just want to flag the devil's in the details here. So we continue to look at it, how it's going to be structured. Similar to state disability leave is basically where the parity exists there. So take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, because we have yet to see the full details and whether or not this will be included in the final budget.
All right. Thank you, Chris. And thank you to all our panelists today. As always, CSBA will keep you updated as we move through the budget process and provide opportunities for you to share your voice and influence the decisions that will work to the benefit of public schools and the decisions you serve. We appreciate your attention today. You'll be hearing from us soon. Thank you and goodbye.